Russia has long denied that its forces are fighting in East Ukraine. But Amnesty International now claims to have concrete proof of direct Russian military involvement in the conflict. Amnesty International Secretary General Salil Shetty says that satellite evidence and eyewitness accounts collected by the human rights NGO leave no doubt that this is now an international armed conflict. Mr. Shetty spoke exclusively to Ukraine Today about the implications of these findings and the need for all sides in the conflict, including the Kremlin, to seek an end to the bloodshed. Secretary General Shetty, thank you very much for joining us tonight on Ukraine Today. Amnesty International has today become the first of the major human rights organizations in the world to recognize the conflict in East Ukraine as an international conflict specifically. How do you think that's going to impact on international perceptions about what's happening in the country?
If I may, before I respond to your question, could I just send a message to the Ukrainian people from Amnesty International just to express our sympathy, our condolences, our solidarity. So many people have lost their lives, their livelihoods, hundreds of thousands displaced, and I just want to say that at the very outset. In terms of, yes, you're right that we are the first major human rights organizations to call this an international conflict, and I should say that when Amnesty makes a statement, it's based on direct, on-the-ground evidence. We are independent, impartial. We are not at anybody's bidding, so we speak truth to power. So certainly, I think the newly acquired satellite images that we have from Novazok region is showing a very well-organized mobilization of artillery and armored units in a way that the separatist forces simply could not have done without the backing of Russia. Equally, this is on top of eyewitness testimonies of what's happening on the ground, of border crossing of tanks, Russian tanks. So I think from our side, there's no doubt that Russia is now a party to the conflict. They're actively and directly involved, and there are serious implications of this statement.
From a legal point of view, so if you're reclassifying it from a domestic or internal conflict to international, does that change the picture? Does that open the way for war crimes trials, for example, or anything like that?
For sure. I think firstly, we have to understand that the full range of Geneva Conventions protocols apply once it's an international conflict. Secondly, also in terms of the direct responsibility for war crimes, to the extent that Russian troops are involved, but also to the extent that Russia is supporting separatist forces, there is individual accountability. And yes, they could be taken to The Hague for war crimes. Anybody responsible could be taken to The Hague. That would require Ukraine to fully submit itself to the Rome Statute, to the International Criminal Court, which they have not done. So they need to do that. And it's also only for crimes after Ukraine signs up to ratifies the Rome Statute fully, so it's not retrospective. I must say that, while it's really important, Amnesty International has been really calling for Ukraine to sign up to ratify the Rome Statute, but at the end of the day, national justice systems are going to be most important in this case.
So when you talk about responsibility on the Russian side for the military engagement, we're talking presumably about the command of Russia, the command, i.e. the commander-in-chief.
That's right. I mean, any individual who's directly involved in war crimes, but also somebody who's ordered it or who's, been aware of it and not stopped it from happening, all of that leads to accountability.
I know that your program here will take you from Kiev tomorrow to Moscow. You'll be presumably engaging there with the leadership in Russia. Now, the Kremlin has consistently adopted a policy of blank denial, despite the fact that evidence has continued to mount up to the point where, in many people's eyes, it is undeniable. Presumably, they will continue to do that. How do you hope to somehow break through that, or make an impact, or somehow suggest that the time has come to change tack?
The way Amnesty International works is that we focus on gathering the evidence and speaking the truth. Governments could be in denial, but that doesn't change the fact. We are not getting any meetings in Russia with the key leadership, and that's a clear indication, unlike in Ukraine, where I am meeting the Prosecutor General, I am meeting the Prime Minister. So I suppose that tells you of some of the differences. But we are going to Russia, we're going to meet with civil society, we're going to meet with media, we're going to meet with anybody who's ready to listen to the facts.
Since you've made this declaration today, presumably you've already had some initial feedback. What has been the response from within the international NGO community, perhaps from the international diplomatic community? Have you had any reaction there that you could share with us?
I mean, in a sense, the evidence was growing. What we've been able to show, because the way we make these statements is based on the ground research and evidence. So I think when Amnesty says something, it gives it certain credibility. So I think people have just welcomed the facts coming out.
Now, the conflict in East Ukraine has seen a major deterioration in human rights across the board. A lot of the major complaints have been directed at insurgent forces who've been holding areas in Lugansk and Donetsk regions. There is a sense, in a way, that these people are pretty much unaccountable. They're not elected forces, they don't represent any recognized bodies. How realistic is it to be able to hope to go in at some point down in the future and gain some justice and gain some clarity of what actually has gone on in these zones?
You know, those who perpetrate crimes, and Amnesty is increasingly finding that both sides in the conflict are responsible for war crimes. We've already talked a lot over the last few months about what's been happening with the separatist forces, the war crimes they're responsible for, the international human rights violations they're responsible for. For example, you know, putting weapons in the middle of civilian populations, or having units which are not really, which are stationed in the middle of civilian populations, all of that, military units. So we've already produced reports or briefings about that. Unfortunately, we're also finding now that, for example, the volunteer battalions that the Ukrainian government is somehow sort of, you know, blessing, also are now increasingly starting to, through abductions, beatings, torture. We're finding more and more cases of that happening. So we have both sides. But your question was, will we ever get justice? And my response to that is that people who perpetrate these kind of crimes think that they're never going to be held accountable. Now, history and Amnesty's international experience has shown that, you know, there's no hiding from justice and truth anymore, because, you know, this is a world where information is so widely available, and sooner or later people will be held to account.
To come back to the issue of the volunteer battalions who are serving alongside the Ukrainian army in the east, what would you like to see from the Ukrainian government? And you say the Ukrainian government has been quite open and is ready to meet you and is ready to enter into a dialogue with Amnesty International. What's going to be your message to them, and what would you like to see from them to show that they're serious about reining in some of these volunteer groups?
Our message is quite simple. You know, the responsibility of all parties to the conflict is to protect the lives of civilians. So there is no getting away from that. And so in this case, I think it is the responsibility of the Ukrainian government to make sure that these kind of beatings, tortures, abductions simply stop, and they do have the ability to stop it. Unfortunately, right now, if you take something like the IDA battalion, which we've been following quite closely, we have now quite a lot of documented evidence of what they've been doing. It's not really clear who they're accountable to in the current Ukrainian government system, because it's the Ministry of Interior, Defense. When we talk to the local commanders, they actually don't even think that they have control over these people and their behavior. So the government has to rein them in, as you said, which means they have to stop them from committing these actions, and then they have to investigate. You know, whenever there's an allegation of war crimes, as of now, there's really very few investigations happening. They need to investigate it quickly, and then they need to bring them to justice.
If we can engage in a little bit of cautious optimism, assuming that down the line the conflict will eventually reach some sort of resolution or pause, based on your experience internationally in conflict zones, what are going to be the key issues here to get some sort of sense of peace back on the ground, to get a sort of resolution where the population can return to normal life without being caught in this cycle of hatreds for generations perhaps to come?
I mean, in the short term, it's really, because, you know, we should talk about the longer term, but in the immediate, I've just come from meeting internally displaced people in one of the locations here. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people who've been pushed out of their homes. So humanitarian assistance, you know, support for these families, some of it is material, some of it is even, you know, the psychological support, because there's almost no support coming from the Ukrainian government now. Almost all of it is happening from the Ukrainian population. You know, people are taking these people into their houses, and it's amazing the outpouring of support at a human level. But the government has to, first of all, stop being in denial about the fact that you have hundreds of thousands of internally displaced people, and that they're not going to go away tomorrow. So they need a law, they need budgets, they need a mechanism to support these people. So that's just to answer the sort of immediacy of this. So protecting civilian lives, supporting humanitarian assistance to IDPs, internally displaced, is most immediate. Now, you asked about where next, and here actually this is really important, because if you want to stop the cycle of violence, if you want to have a resolution in the post-conflict phase, if you want to live up to the aspirations of the Euromaidan protesters, if you want to live up to the values which the President, the Prime Minister are constantly talking about, then we need rule of law, which is why, if you have these battalions running amok, if you have torture rife in the eastern zone, so what is the point of getting these areas, territories back from the separatist forces if the behaviors are not changing? You see, so I think Ukrainians fought for this revolution to make sure that the values of human rights, dignity, justice are upheld, and I think that's what they need to do. So even if you take the protests in Euromaidan, for example, people were attacked during that time. As we speak, almost no case has been properly investigated, no prosecutions, no indictments. So, and we've called for something very simple. You need an independent police commission, because how do you get the police and the security forces to investigate themselves? You need something independent to investigate. And so this basic rule of law, basic institutions, independent institutions, are crucial for the future of this country.
Secretary General Shetty, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.